Okay. You can take a seat if you're underway with our next speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Jim Regimbal, President of Fiscal Analytics here in Richmond. Many of you have heard Jim speak before. VML and VACo rely on Jim for sound fiscal analysis throughout the year. Jim has 30 years of experience in the state and local budget and tax policy analysis. He was on the staff of the Virginia Senate Finance Committee from 1987 to 1999, where he provided the committee with expertise in tax policy, economic and revenue forecasting, and transportation and finance agency budgets. Please welcome Jim Regimbal.
Good morning. Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it. Just in keeping with today's news about Senator Colgan, he was my transportation subcommittee chairman at Senate Finance, and what a wonderful man he was. I'm going to miss him. I always remember the day I got invited up to the hangar at the Manassas Airport. He had his airline operations there, and I went back in and I looked at his car collection. Talk about it. Wow, this man was interesting. I mean, he had 1950s Ford Studebakers and Thunderbirds and you name it, the kind of cars in that hangar of his. So that's one of my recollections of him. I thought I'd share that with you. It was also good to have Betsy go first, because what I'm going to do today is try to extend what she said and place her comments in a little larger context, where I place local government in that context of the state budget, and get you to think about a longer-term policies that you may want to move through your local government organizations. And that's really, I think, one of the goals here, is for you to think medium and long-term, where you need to place yourself, your city, your local governments in the context of state policy. And so that's one of my goals here as well. There is going to be a little bit of review. I kind of do it a little differently than Betsy. But there'll be a little bit of overlap, because I want to make sure that we get the story right here. And so Betsy talked about prior growth in the general fund revenues, and you're going to see how key that is. There's a few key elements in the state budget and how that impacts local government. And one of them, obviously the first keys, is revenue growth. And so we've got growth now forecasted at about 3% for this current biennium. It's up a little higher than what it was. So that's good news, and the question becomes whether it's going to get even better by February when they do their final reforecast. I want to give you a rule of thumb. If we grow 1% more than that 3% in 17, that will add $400 million to the general fund budget, because you're going to get $200 million this year and a higher base for next year, another $200 million, all else being equal in next year's forecast. So 1% in 17 changes things quite a bit, $400 million more. The new forecast, which raised it 1.7 to 3.0, and then actually dropped 18 a little bit down to 3.2, but it's still, because of that first year change, plus the tax policy, raised $451 million more than what you heard in August, out of that $1.5 billion shortfall. So you add $450 million more dollars. Betsy talked about prior decades. We used to grow for a long time, almost 6% in Virginia, almost 6%. Part of the reduction, and of course we had the recession, 2-year growth was negative 5% over the 2 years. That hit us hard. But since then, we've only grown 4.1%. Part of that, on the revenue side, is reduced inflation. Part of it's job changes, which I'm going to talk about, and Ann Battle-Charis, who's here from the Federal Reserve, is going to talk about. But also, I want you to know, yes, reduced inflation, but not a lot of the things that the state has to fund. It's not the case in healthcare. There has been reduced inflation in healthcare, and maybe Ms. Macheras can discuss how healthcare inflation fits into overall inflation, because I don't see it there. And again, you see the growth in revenues about 3% for the coming, which is less than what we had since 2011, since the recovery. But the good news here might be is those forecasts might be low. They might be low. Maybe Ann will give us, Ms. Macheras will give us a better understanding of that as well going forward. One of the reasons that we have had lower revenue is because we've had a changing job mix. And as Betsy mentioned, you don't get as much tax revenue out of lower-paying jobs, even if you have twice as many low-paying as higher-paying. And look where the red lines are in this chart. Those are the high-paying jobs. The average weekly wage, I've sorted this the higher wages is at the top, but that's also generally where the job losses over the last 5 years have been. I did this for Fairfax County, same story in Fairfax. Obviously, Fairfax sort of drives Virginia in many ways as well. But, you know, higher paying jobs are slower growing. Lower paying jobs have had the most growth. So therefore, we're not getting as much tax revenue. We rely on income taxes, particularly. This is the good news. Through the first 5 months, we had over 5% revenue growth versus the forecast of about 3%. Now, that's going to come down. In the next 6 days, about maybe less than 2 weeks, we'll get the numbers for December. And because we had an anomaly in November's withholding, an extra deposit day, which provided $130+ million more than that probably got taken out of December, you're going to see a negative withholding growth number for December because of that anomaly. We are going to be looking at sales too. I believe sales are in a secular low growth. Betsy also talked about that because of more spending on services, loss of revenues to more and more internet sales. Millennials don't spend as much. Baby boomers like me have. All our things, we don't spend as much. Sales taxes, I believe, are in secular flat decline. But the good news, again, I think we're going to be still above that 2017 forecast. So the non-withholding estimated payments in January and the withholding in January are going to be key. And the sales from Christmas that show up in the January collections, remember they have 20 days to send their money into the state after they make the sales tax. That's why January is such a big month. And the reforecast in February, it's a good chance we're going to be above 3%. The General Assembly might take a step to raise it even further. Don't know if that's the case, but a good chance. Here's the trend. If you look at 12 months of withholding, and each dot goes back 12 months. Right now, we're at 4%. Expect that to be more like 3.5, 12-month moving average when you get the December withholding put in there. That's still better than the forecast. It's trending a little bit higher, so there's a possibility we can get a higher forecast in February. Here's why it's been so tough. Betsy mentioned it's a different kind of chart. It shows you the blue line's withholding growth historically. The red line is non-withholding. Withholding is about 60% of the general fund, non-withholding about 17%. They capped it, actually, because we've had better growth in non-withholding than we historically have, so they actually, in their forecasts, have capped it to a certain degree, and that gives opportunity for a revenue surplus at the end of the year if they go above that cap. And you can see why it's so hard to forecast the non-withholding, which is capital gains, businesses paying estimated payments, not withheld money. It's gone up and down, and that's why it's been so hard to forecast. We actually did a decent job of forecasting non-withholding last year. Believe it or not, it's gone back from 20% down to almost zero growth. They're expecting zero growth again. Another opportunity if we do better. Although tax policy changes are in the air, that makes people change their behaviors, so it's going to make it even harder to forecast non-withholding. You know, they'll save them, they won't, you know, they'll hold income or they'll put income in the next year depending on the tax policy. We're talking about tax cuts next year, so people probably didn't take gains in 16. They're going to wait until 17. So it won't show up for a year and a half. So you file your tax returns not this spring, but the following spring if they withheld, you know, those sales. So it's hard to forecast non-withholding. Tax policy changes, Betsy did a good job of talking about that. Here's what they are. You know, we might talk about, at the end of this presentation, some options I want you to think about. She talked about tax reform as well, and I think that's a key subject, which I'm going to point out why, in a sense, because we may be coming to the point where we do have to seriously talk about tax reform, because the economic growth in Virginia is not going to keep pace with the needs that the state and local governments have. Simply put, go back to the introduced budget, how did the governor balance the budget? Well, it's really not that difficult if you look at it in a broad sense. You use rainy day funds. As Betsy mentioned, we're going to be down to about $250 million, I think she said $240 million. And the prospects of putting money back into the rainy day fund are probably not going to happen because the threshold to start putting money back in by the Constitution is you have to be above the prior 6-year average. That prior 6-year average is now over 4%. So it's not until we get better than 4% growth we're going to see any money put back in the rainy day funds. That's good and bad. It's not being taken out and not sent to, let's say, K-12, but it's also not being saved for another downturn we might have in the future. So unless the General Assembly decides to put it without use of the formula, just says we're going to put money in there, there probably won't be much put into the rainy day fund in the near future, near immediate future. Also, you know the salary increases were cut. I told you about the 400+ million revenues through transfers and the revenue growth and tax policy. Then there was agency unspent balances that were used and reductions in agency appropriations to a certain degree. We also captured unspent capital balances. I don't think Betsy mentioned that, but buildings that had money already, debt floated for buildings to be built, primarily higher education, but not all, some state government buildings. They're taking the cash, they're going to have to refloat more debt in some cases to finish that out. So we actually, that's one balancing action that you didn't mention that's interesting. And then, of course, we had more lottery revenues, more literary fund revenues, and more tobacco taxes than estimated, which is the Virginia Healthcare Fund. And that was used to offset general funds. So instead of other purposes, they were used to offset the downturn of general funds. And then targeted reductions, you know, they're termed technical, but they still, you know, you have to face the consequences of that when the student population forecasts are lower than expected, which were built into the last forecast, or sales tax collections are lower than expected. Those technical reductions actually, you know, you built into your budget are now not there. And so that's actual real money lost to local government school divisions. And so you're going to see those in reduced state funding through those technical reductions in those two areas primarily as well. The major, so those major are listed there at $1.9 billion. Then they had to add money to the budget. Medicaid, $255. They put the bonus plan in. That they didn't have to, but they put the bonus plan in, Governor. The CSA, Children's Services Act money, it's because it's a some sufficient funding source. They have to provide the money when kids are put into that program. They found out they're underfunded it. Some sufficient, $86 million over bonds being put into that. Of course, you match about a third of that. There's another cost center for you. But add about a third that's not on that $86 million at the local side. And then the mental health funding as well. A lot of that is to help local efforts because you provide much of the services. This is the state budget. I know it's an eye chart. What I do want you to look at is this is just general funds. So that's the reduction over the biennium in K-12. That's the increase in Medicaid. This balances out. This is literally, you can take the State Appropriation Act standard. Last year's adopted, this year's introduced, and these are the actual numbers by those basically secretarial areas, except for a few like debt. You know, and this is by secretary in the name. And that's the changes in general funding. Now, the reason why it's actually less felt is because they use literary lottery funds, which aren't general funds, so offset about $100 million of that cut in general fund, okay? That's why the 273 goes down to 167 in dollars to you guys. But it's still a cut, 167 million. Plus we're using lottery literary funds, especially literary could be used for something else, like school construction loans. So that's the state budget. Now, look a little bit, get you to think a little bit longer term here. Okay, so these are the growth rates, and I alluded to this a minute ago about healthcare cost increases. So you can see Medicaid growth has grown from 15% of the state budget, 15 years ago. It's now 22% of the state budget. And so it's eating up a greater and greater and greater share of the state budget. That isn't counting Medicaid expansion. That's the cost of healthcare utilization and inflation. And a lot of that has to do with long-term care, age, blind, and disabled. That's about 60% of the spending for Medicaid, age, blind, and disabled. Okay? So it's not necessarily, it is low-income children, pregnant women too. We don't cover healthy adults. We haven't expanded Medicaid. But a lot of it is really long-term care, people who are very, very ill, and they're in long-term care facilities, age, blind, and disabled. So here's the growth trend. We got this way wrong, 2016. That was supposed to be a lot lower growth. It turned out to be 9.3%. There was some woodworking effect, people realizing because of all of the Obamacare advertising, people became aware, yes, we actually can qualify for Virginia's Medicaid. We had to sign up, so there was some of that as well in there. But the forecast, I crossed out what was in last year's budget, adopted budget of growth. This is what it is now. One of the questions is whether this 4.1 is too low. We probably got a good handle on the current year, 7.4. That's a far cry higher than the 3.8 they had last year. So again, I want you to think about the prospects of slowing Medicaid growth, and I mentioned that a lot of it has to do with elderly in nursing homes, long-term care facilities. I did a study 10 years ago about this issue. At that time, there was 25,000 Medicaid recipients in Virginia long-term care facilities. I don't know what it is now. I haven't done that study in a while. It was 25,000. But look at the trends. This is a lot of these. I know that at the time, a lot of them were 85. That was the biggest chunk. These people that were elderly. A lot of them, 85, 90 years old. Your grandma, your grandfather. Well, look at the growth. You know, it's not just over 65, but there's a huge growth. Right now, 150,000 or so. It's probably not quite that high. Maybe 140,000. It's going to grow to 280,000 by 2040, or 194,000. So that's a growing segment of society, and that's old, 85 and older. It's growing. So I have a hard time believing Medicaid costs are going to be moderated just because of that one demographic statistic right there. Debt service is another one. We've gone from a pay-as-you-go state where we use cash for our capital to using debt to pay for our capital needs in Virginia. Because of the strains on our revenue strains, it translates into still needing buildings, still need to maintain, still need to do things in capital. We haven't had the cash, we've had to float debt. We're pretty much maxed out on our credit card, pretty much. A little bit of room, pretty much. And I just looked in the last few days on the Debt Capacity Advisory Committee report that's put out by the Treasury Department this December. And if you put in the authorized but unissued debt that we already have authorized, but it's not planned to issue for the next few years, that gets us not to here, it gets us up to about $870 million. And that's with no new issuances, no new authorizations, which a lot of people want to authorize new debt for various things. I mean, I think of a few off the top of my head, but just the ones that have already been authorized, but planned to issue gets us to 870. Okay, we're at 780 right now in the budget, in the introduced budget. So that's a growth area, continue to be a growth area as well. Well, let's put this together now. This is where I want you to think a little bit medium to longer term. So right here is the actual budget. And so what I did was I took Medicaid, and then I took K-12 direct aid to you folks, and then everything with debt service I put in this line, because debt service is growing as well. And I said, okay, here's where we are. We're dropping everything else. K-12, yeah, it's going up a little bit this in 18. The governor made it a priority, General Assembly's made it a priority. But if Medicaid, then I said, okay, Medicaid, I'm going to grow it at about a little over 6% a year. Okay? Well, first thing is I use the official revenue forecast that the governor puts out with his introduced budget for the longer term. I use those. Those range from 3.2% to 4% out to 2026. 3.2 to 4. So that's the first thing you got to do. Then you say Medicaid is going to grow at 6%. Does that sound plausible? I mean, that's sort of what it's been. It hasn't changed. It's been higher than that. It's been 8%. I'm actually taking it down to a little over 6%, thinking we might find a way to save some money. So there's the trend in Medicaid. Okay, it's a percent of the general fund budget. Everything else, that's why when you start thinking about is tax policy is something, we need to either grow faster than 3.2 to 4% in revenue. We need a better economy. Ann's going to tell us about how we're going to get a better economy, right, Ann? Or you got to change your tax system. Or you're going to have this trend. You're going to have it slowly, or you figure out a way to slow down Medicaid spending. Nobody's figured that out yet. And I told you the demographic part of it. So here, this is K-12 direct aid growing at 3%. That's 3%, roughly the rate of growth in the general fund. Slightly less. But Medicaid continues to eat it up. Well, everything else, so how do you pay? How do you give raises to state employees? How do you keep your state police? How do you fund your constitutional health? How do you fund your health, your community health care systems and mental health? How do you keep up with the pay for state employees with the outside world? you know, in this scenario. That's the part that's depressing to me. I'm sorry, and you know, I've done this to you several times before, but there are answers. There are policy answers to this. And that's why I want you guys to think about that. What are the policy answers to these trends right here? Because right now, that's what we're in. We're in that trend. Okay? So how did you fare in this budget? Well, as stated, you know, there was no policy changes per se to a large degree to local government, but you did get hit with changes in the forecast for sales tax, slower growing sales taxes, not as many students as they thought. You still have to fund the same classrooms and teachers probably, and people in your schools. There was some cuts around the edges of local government. Go Virginia. Big effort to put in place an economic development effort, regional, you know, getting localities to cooperate. You know, W. Wayne of Hampton Roads has been leading that. It's still in effect. I'm sure he was surprised to see $15 million cut out of that initiative that spent so much time putting together. $15 million was cut out of that. Smaller reductions to things I've got in there, like the enterprise zone program. Again, those are economic development initiatives, brownfield economic development. And then where did the money come for localities? Well, the Some Sufficient Child Services Act, which you have to match, and mental health funding, which has been a big, big push. So you can see when priorities are pushed, they actually do get some funding. But that $31 million is nowhere near enough to solve your issues in your jails, that you need your community service boards, and this issue, the rampant opioid crisis we have going on in Virginia. That's nowhere near enough. It's an attempt, given the constraints in the budget, to put some money there. That's what it is. And then, of course, you've got a little bit of money for the teachers and the state support locals in the bonus, which will probably be reworked by the General Assembly, is my guess, because let's talk about the 55 million teachers for a second. So that's enough only to fund 1.5% for the standards of quality recognized positions in your school divisions. That's only about 2/3 of the positions. If you have to give 1.5 to everyone, you're going to have to give your local composite share of that 1.5 plus 100% of the 1/3 that aren't covered at all in the SOQ. So I got a feeling because of what happened last year, they sort of pulled the rug out at 2%. You know, a lot of them probably gave the 2%. Didn't get the money. That's going to be an issue because that 1.5, you got to put a lot more money to supply 1.5 to everyone. Okay. Now, me and Betsy have a little different accounting. I took Rick Brown's accounting, Secretary of Finance. It's not that she's wrong. She might have a few other programs in her accounting of aid to localities. What I've tried to do over time is keep it consistent, the exact same programs, and I think they're pretty much everything, and I do match for the most part. But by being consistent, I can track the 52% you got from the general fund for these programs since 09, and then in simplicity, I had to cut out some years, but you're at 42% now at 17. And that's the result of slower revenues, higher growth in Medicaid, and higher needs in debt service. They had to cut somewhere, so they cut higher ed, and they cut aid to localities in relative terms. So you're down to 42% of the general fund, 52, for the exact same programs. Most of these programs, including K-12 right now, you're virtually the same nominal dollars from the general fund for K-12 than you had in 09. Virtually the same. Real terms, much, much less. But pretty much everything else, with the exception of CSA being growing, it went down for a while, but now it's going back up. And then this, community, which is mental health, has been getting some money recently. Community service boards are in it. Okay? They made that a priority. But pretty much everything else has been virtually flat or very small growth in nominal dollars since 09. So your big 75% of aid to localities is the K-12 direct aid. So I guess this is on a per pupil basis. Per pupil, 17, roughly the same as 09, as we said. Even our per pupil, but look, there's $600 here versus here in 09, less in real dollars. That's only about 2% inflation a year, but that 2% compounds over time, and because there's been no growth in nominal dollars, you're about $600 less per pupil than what you got in 09. That's part of the reason you're feeling a lot of pain at the local level. because K-12 funding hasn't kept pace with, you know, the inflation. So the Board of Education has finally recommended to rectify the situation because what you are doing at the local level doesn't correspond with standards of quality. And so they recognize that the actual need to provide a well-equipped, well-trained, well-supplied school division, the standards of quality is not adequate, and because of policy changes that have taken place to actually save money, really, they recognize not adequate. I mentioned the two-thirds, 136,000 out of 200,000 you actually employ or funded by the SOQ. That's that two-thirds on it, 136. VACo put a budget in, and last year put budget amendments in for a couple items. You know, you get about 3,000. We have about 3,000 teacher aides. I'm sorry, the SOQ covers about 3,000 teacher aides. You have 19,000 employees. There's one act. You know, but here's what the board recommended. So they're going to restore, if the General Assembly funded their proposal, they would restore the prevailing practice of your support positions that they cut in 09. That was cut in 09. It's $350 to $370 million per year. This in total is about $600 million per year. $600 million. So that gets you pretty much back to almost, not quite, but it gets you back to where you were in 09 in real dollars on a per pupil basis, if these were adopted. The funny part about this, when I asked one of the representatives of the government what they thought about this, they declined to even discuss it. So I'm not sure that's on officially their radar screen. I know they're aware of it, but it's officially on the radar screen. I think one of the ideas I have for you today publicly is you ought to make people aware of this. This ought to be part of your platform, in my opinion, that this is funded, that this gets funded. The board, their board, has recommended these changes, $600 million a year, and that you guys ought to consider being part of your platform. So, in summary, two-thirds are covered by the SOQ, the positions. The reasons why you spend double what you're required to, on average, localities in Virginia pay double than what the state standards of quality require you to match. So instead of $3.6 billion, you put $7.2 billion in the state's education system. Okay? Now it varies by locality, which you can see. Some are well more than 100%, some are under. You know, and a lot of the fiscal stress has to do with the lack of state funding for public education. Petersburg is now at exactly matching the part of local effort. They're in this 16. They don't have the funds anymore. They like to spend more, but they don't have the funds. So the other reasons, support costs have been defunded since 2009. And the linear weighted average policy that's used by the state to determine how much they're going to pay. They're going to recognize the standards of quality in terms of teacher pay, assistant principal pay, is based on a linear weighted average, and there's a lot more small localities in rural areas than there are the Fairfaxes, Arlingtons, Henricos, Hamptons, Newport Newses, which have higher pay than the lower cost rural localities. But they give one each the same value, and so they lop off the ends, give them all the same value, so their median, using that methodology, is less than the actual weighted average median. And so that's another way to save money. So, to give you another way to think about this, if we raise teacher salaries in Virginia to the national average, we're about 35th right now. We pay our teachers about 35th, even though we're the 10th wealthiest state. If we brought us down to 25th national average, and then we funded this prevailing support cost that you provide, that would be $750 million a year. So it's a little different way than the board's calculation of explicitly doing things. If you just did those two things, that would be $750 million. This topic also came up, and I was asked by a gentleman about the cost of localities for moving up to raise the retirement rates. Right now, the teacher system is funded at about 70%, the teacher retirement system. And that's because, and you know, Wall Street, bond ratings, we like to see pension systems fund at least 90%, at least 90%. We're at 70 in our teacher fund system. And so the General Assembly was wanted to accelerate the return to actually funding the calculated rates that are needed to get us back over time to that 90% level or thereabouts. This chart, what it shows you is we haven't funded those rates since '01, really. These are the difference in rates and what's been proposed and actually funded, and this is the loss of money. In total, is $3.6 billion in unfunded contributions over that time period. 3.6. Now, if you compounded that with the rate of, with the return, the investment return you would have gotten by putting that into the trust fund, you'd have double that. Into the, we would obviously be at. That's how you'd be at 100% funding. So that's what we've done, especially during the recession. They cut the rates to save money. And they did save $200 million a year. Well, we're going back to fully funding. And that's a policy that apparently the General Assembly wants to stick to. And I know that's an issue for some local government and school organizations to delay that a little further. But you heard Betsy talk about it's probably not going to happen. They probably want to keep that system viable and funded. I know there's issues on both sides. I don't want to get in the middle of that, but that's sort of the reality of it and the facts of it right here. The other thing I got to mention of the difficulty in teaching students. So we have this underfunding of K-12, but then we have a student population that's changed rapidly. Over the last 10 years, we've gone from 10 percentage points higher in at-risk children, those receiving free lunch. You add reduced lunch on top of that, you're at 42%. Of the student population of Virginia public school is free reduced lunch. 36 is just free. We've also had changing demographics. This is 10 years from 03, 04 to 14. Huge increase in Hispanic population. ESL, that means English as a second language, increased 63%. Harder to teach. And then the special ed students, 13% of the student population. Some of those are going into CSA, but a lot of those are still special ed programs within your school division that you have to fund. So it's a more difficult student population along with flat funding from the state and less inflation terms. So we want to fix the achievement gap. You have mandates to graduate students, to get them to pass the SOLs. But we still have problems. 20% of our schools, even with the change in accreditation, are still not fully accredited. And you have that same gap in economically disadvantaged minority students with others, in the achievement gap that needs to be fixed. We need to bring all these students up to a quality education. So that requires well-trained people, well-paid people, probably to attract them, and funding. So that's the other side of the lack of growth in state funding, is the inability to attract the best and brightest into the profession. Although there's lots of good, I don't mean to disparage it, but I think everyone's feeling it's harder and harder to recruit teachers, young people, to the profession. If you're a math major in college, and you can go out and fill one of Governor McAuliffe's 37,000 cybersecurity jobs, 88,000 a year, it's going to be pretty difficult to attract that person to teaching math in school. And that's just the fact of the matter. So I have children that age. I mean, 30, 20-something, 30-something. I hear that all the time. So that's part of the issue of being able to pay appropriate salaries. CSA, we went down in funding when we moved kids from the residential, more expensive residential kids back into the community. That saved money for a while. But someone asked the question, yes. And partially, special ed day placements are very expensive, and that's a big chunk of the rising cost here. And one factoid that's been presented is autism diagnoses have increased 220% over the last 10 years. And so, for some reason, there's much more autism being diagnosed, and a lot of that is severe enough to have to be placed in the CSA program. That's one of the big costs in driving this growth in CSA. Another ramification of not having the money to fund is sort of a slow rolling, let's just keep everything level. And so the HB 580 police program, you can say the same about sheriffs and their pay. It goes back to that chart I tried to show you the trends on, the long-term chart. Well, if you don't have any money to give your localities for 599, it becomes the end of the barrel, so to speak. So if they actually funded the statute, when this was created in 1979 or 1980, said we're going to grow 599 at the rate of the growth of the general fund. That whole program was part of a package, to compensate localities for loss of annexation. Part of it. So that was the deal. We're going to grow at the rate of the growth of the general fund. Well, so I just said, okay, let's take a look at the growth of the general fund from 2000. They kind of normalized things in 2000. They really underfunded you in 99, and they brought it up to speed in 2000. So let's take a look from there. So if we took a look from there, you're 116 million per year below what the growth of the general fund would have provided for 599. That's just one program. So instead of the 178 million that's distributed now to the 9 counties, cities, and towns, it would be almost 300 million that you shouldn't get. VACo pressed the General Assembly for years on this issue. Hard to get traction because of the realities of the growth in revenues and the general fund demands. So now let's take a quick look at your situation, the local government situation. So I went back and I said, how much did your revenues in total grow since '09, since the sort of the recession peak, right before the recession? And then taking into account that recession and how we've grown out of it. You've grown about 2% a year, 2% a year, 12%. Well, the state is only providing you about 1% of your growth in revenue and support. Okay, in total, a little less than 10. Just population inflation in the state of Virginia, looking at the CPI, official CPI numbers, and official population is almost 17%. So there you go. That's why you're feeling this pain. Not just because a lot of your things are inflating faster than inflation. They are. But you're not even getting that with your revenue situation. Now let's take a look at your largest revenue source. One of the other reasons. So I looked at the growth of your 50% of local revenues are real estate taxes. Even greater share is income taxes for the state. And so, yeah, they're almost equal at the bottom of that recession in 2010. The total dollars, obtained from those two revenue sources were pretty equal. Well, look at the gap now. And they provide you less support. Even with their biggest revenue source, 2/3 of their general fund is on this growth trajectory. Flips more because I start here. But you're only at this. And if you put 16, it'll probably be here. So the gap is going to be $2.5 billion between that time period. And so your revenue source has not grown nearly as fast as their revenue source has. And guess what? To get that growth on the last page I just showed you, you had to raise your taxes to get that growth. You actually had to raise it in cities. Median rates gone up 16 cents from 9 to calendar 15 and 10 cents per county. So to get that low growth, to keep, to get even what you got, you had to raise your taxes to do it. And tough situation politically, economically that you're in. So, conclusion is pretty simple, really. You're getting significantly underfunded by the state, both in K-12 and pretty much everything else. They're shifting responsibility to you. The reason why is because they have lower growth in revenues, higher growth in Medicaid and debt service. They've also, in the same time period, over the last 20 years, when times were good for them, basically in the late 90s for the most part, in the late 2000s, in the housing boom, they cut their tax base. I'm going to show you that in a second. So they didn't anticipate this lower growth trend that we're in now in those two time frames, when the growth was temporarily higher in the general fund. And then your local revenues are strained. You're having to raise rates, and we're hoping that the housing market continues to demand and recover and assessments start to grow. So maybe in the future things will look a little bit better in real estate. That's definitely hopeful. But still, the state needs to shoulder more of its burden. And so that's where the policy issues have to come into play. This is the $3 billion cuts in the tax base for the general fund. They did raise it by about $1 billion in 2005. Higher sales taxes, some savings by means testing the age deduction, eliminated some corporate rates, and added a little bit for Amazon sales taxes. They have a presence here, and raise the tobacco tax to 30 cents. Goes to the healthcare fund, uses to help being paid for Medicaid. But the net counts the car tax, yes, $2 billion. Take out the car tax, you're still $1 billion lower base. Out of a $20 billion general fund budget, that's significant. It's very significant still. So that's part of their problem, is they change their tax base. I'll give you a couple examples. So I'm trying to lure data centers to Virginia, primarily in northern Virginia too. That's where they like to locate, closer to DC for some reason. We've given them a sales tax exemption for all their equipment. They buy equipment, and then when they need to refresh that equipment, when it goes, we still get a sales tax exemption. So even when they're here, a couple years, they need to buy new computers, they get a sale. That's about $75 million a year. It's not insignificant. I'll give you another one. We used to have a 3-factor formula to compute the share of a corporation in Virginia's profits, how much they would pay in Virginia corporate income tax. It would be your sales, your employment, and your property percentage of, let's say, the worldwide business. How much percent the average is here? What percentage of employees are here, percentage of sales are here, percentage of properties here. You take the average, you apply that to your total worldwide profits, you pay that Virginia 6% corporate income tax. Well, that got modified to allow corporations to now use a single sales factor. The reason they did that was to lure businesses and maybe to keep, like Altria and Chesterfield, that do exports, or the engine plant, the Rolls-Royce plant, lure export-based big businesses. And they probably don't pay much income because all their sales are exported. If they're using a single sales factor, all those cigarettes are exported, you don't pay any Virginia corporate income tax. That's about $75 million a year. So there's things in here that are pretty sizable, that if you look at redo corporate income tax, I mean, not corporate, but if you do a tax reform effort that Betsy talked about, there's a lot more than meets the eye that can be looked at, and that may, change rates, but also the same at the federal level they're talking about. There's a lot more to it, the loopholes and things that are in there versus rates. And so that's sort of the last thing I want to talk about here. It comes down to, okay, what are some of the options for not just strengthening and diversifying, but I should say modernizing the tax base of Virginia. Modernizing. So we would need to do a large scale. If you're going to look at the income of corporate, it's got to have to be a large scale, because you're going to have to look at a lot of things to actually, remember, that's 70%. You take individual corporate as the total general fund. And it also does a good job of tracking changes in the economy, unlike the sales tax, which is shifting the services. The income tax does, I think, does a pretty good job. So if you're going to really get real reform, you've got to look at the income tax. And just as this is an example. I'm not trying to say this is what they would do or should do. But we have an age deduction, you can get $65,000 to $12,000 a year. Should that be modified? Should that be reduced? I mean, it's expensive to do that. And we do means test it, but some of the same means who's trying to start a family at 25, they have 2 kids, maybe in just the same straits, don't get that $12,000 subtraction. I know there's lots of arguments both ways, but that's an example. Sales taxes. Many states apply their sales taxes to personal services. We have a pretty narrow sales tax in Virginia. Now, we're not going to probably tax hospitals, put a sales tax on doctors' visits, all that's been proposed, or if you don't do that, the attorneys and the architects, and the white-collar worker sales tax on their charges. If you don't do that, you probably won't do the plumbers and electricians and blue-collar, but you can do personal services, okay? And it's not nearly as much, but auto repair labor is probably $150 million a year. $150 million a year. When you go and get your car repaired, you're not paying parts. You get a bill. You could easily just say, look, whole bill, sales tax on it. Many states do that. Another example, now I'll probably get in a lot of trouble when people come out at me, but nonprofit hospitals. They buy lots of things and they don't pay a sales tax. Now they're going to say they provide uncompensated care and lots of charity care. They do. So that's why it's hard to do. They do have a good case there. But it's very expensive to give nonprofit hospitals sales tax exemption. We also So we need to think about our sales tax. We're going to make it grow. And another example down here, let's go down to this one. I think it was Colorado, right, Neil? They had the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed by not taking up the case. Colorado requires anyone who sells the internet, if they don't collect the tax because they don't have a physical presence in the state, they have to inform the individual that they're required to pay the use tax, because that's still Virginia's law too. If you buy something over $100, you're supposed to file a use tax form and pay the sales tax. The sales ain't use tax. Nobody does, except a few people like my wife. She's an orthodontist. They come after those kind of people. They look at the tax code. So that's why we pay the use tax. So, Colorado's law, you have to inform the individual, but you also inform the revenue department of that individual. And that's been affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court. That's legal. That's not collecting it, which has been termed illegal beyond present. The informing of everyone that they're required to do this has been affirmed apparently illegal. Do that in Virginia. I think that the trouble for these companies actually informing would be a lot more than actually doing the collecting. Might be an idea. Here's another one. So when we had the go-go years of the housing boom, we had a transportation funding problem, so we hadn't raised our gas tax since 1987. So we started peeling away general funds to pay for, help pay for transportation costs. We've been underfunding like crazy. That was solved to a certain degree in 2013, not fully solved. Ask Transit about that, the transit community, public transit community. But we took some general funds. That's part of that $2 billion that I have on that other page over to transportation. Well, that was done on the thought that the general fund was going to continue to grow at 6% a year. They could afford to do that. Well, obviously that's not the case. It should be paid back. Another idea is, some of these are controversial. People batter me about this. Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia pays 6% sales tax now, 0.7 to transportation. That doesn't seem to be a huge impact in those two regions. Half the state, maybe the rest of the state, go to 0.7, put those sources back into the general fund, use the 0.7 from the statewide 6% to help this go back to the general fund, funds that were in the general fund. So there's an idea. Communication sales tax. In 2004, big compromise. We bundled all the communication taxes into one 5% tax. The state decided to collect it for you guys and take a little cutoff in their collection and send it back out to you. Guess what? That tax is now 20% lower than it was in 2004 because the communication environment has changed. And satellite radio is a lot less charges. But even more so, prepaid calling cards. First time you buy a prepaid calling, it's amazing how many people use prepaid wireless service, not monthly, just buy a card. First time you buy, you fill up $200, pay the sales tax, communicate. Every time you fill it up after that, you don't. That's a lot of money. And then the Hulu's, Netflix's, Amazon Prime's on cash. So that's the part about modernizing our tax system that we haven't done. That community sales tax is 20% less than it was before in real nominal dollars. How about increasing the tobacco tax? It's tough in Virginia, but each cent tobacco tax is $6 million. We're worth 30 cents. A lot of states, more dollars per pack. So we have room there. I know we're a tobacco state. And the other thing on communication, guess what? We had a sales tax of 5% back in 2004. Guess what the statewide rate is now? 5.3. Put that to 5.3. That'll help you guys. It's an idea for you. Go to 6%, like Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia. Significant amount of dollars. Talking. I think I had it written down. I forget now. I did write it down. You went to 6%. That'd be $80 million on the current base. And if you change the base, it'd be more than that. Communication sales tax. If you went to 5.3, that alone was $25 million. Not a lot. If you add in conjunction with changing the base and capturing some of those items, then it would be a lot more. So there's another idea. We know about the counties by ordinance, meals taxes. Meals taxes are statewide is a pretty large revenue source. It's $545 million. But many localities and counties can't take advantage of it. Fairfax, as an example, just had their referendum voted down. I don't know if they do it by ordinance now or not, but you're having to take the responsibility for the state's programs. You ought to have the responsibility to be able to decide from your elected representatives some of your tax base as well. And then, lastly, the car tax. This is not going to happen this session, but maybe at some point the state will decide that it can't afford the $950 million car tax. And it's controversial. It's getting less and less every year because it's static. Less and less to the individuals, the importance of it. But it's $950 million a year, and if you phased it out over time, maybe not down to zero, maybe something less, again, that would help. So there's some ideas about the tax base. The biggest one, I think getting into a whole lot of stuff, the income tax. That's going to take some work and study about how that would be done. Especially given that North Carolina just last 2 years reduced their top rate to the same as ours. So there seems to be a competition to keep that top rate as low as possible. So I do have an appendix in here that you can look at about sort of the most important local revenue sources. You can see by far the real estate tax. Service charges is pretty important. VACo, which seems to get under attack by the General Assembly, machinery and tools, $900 million we have together. It's more than the corporate income tax for the state. So, obviously, pretty important. Then the state sources, fiscal, general, and transportation taxes. You can see the relative importance of the state taxes. By the way, this sales tax does not include the regional nor the Virginia Hampton roads tax. You have to factor another, $400 or $500 million into that. We want to add that in mentally. There's the largest local sources. And here's some of the rates in our surrounding states. You want to take a look? So, give you some of the difficulties of doing reform. What they do is we compete with those surrounding states, sales tax, income tax. Take a look for leisure at that. And that completes my presentation. Happy to answer questions. Yes, ma'am. They have a lot of those. They have a lot of those in place. Yeah, the question is, JLARC recommended putting sunsets on tax credits and taxes, sales tax exemptions. And a lot of those have sunsets already. They've started doing that, but they just continually. In fact, there's a bill, I was going through some of the pre-filed bills. The coal tax credit, there's a bill in to extend their sunset. So they routinely just extend those sunsets. So it doesn't, sunsets, they force them in a way to take a look at various things, and yes, they do, but it hasn't seemed to actually say, okay, in many cases, it might have been a few. Do you think of one deal that there's been a sunsets actually allowed to happen recently? I'm trying to think of it. No. Yeah, so, I can't either, but I'll look into that and make sure I'm right. Yes, sir.
Do you have any analytics that affect communities or states that host a university? Property tax is diminished because the universities expand and take over the real property. Do you have any data that deals with that?
No, I've seen that issue. I know it's come up several times, payment in lieu of taxes, things. And in fact, I asked the question to a university representative last session. So I think it's a question. And I think there's two of them do have very small policies providing some payment in lieu of taxes, but it's not uniform nor is it generic. But it is an issue where maybe that could be something more looked into.
Yeah, if you did, I think that'd be interesting for Bradford and Blacksburg and Charlottesville.
I know UVA has a small payment in lieu of taxes program. They're small, because I did ask them. I'm sure it's not the size you'd like.
The other question that I had was, there was a deadline for Frank Beans was looking at revisiting the community services boards
representatives have been following pretty closely what they call the Deeds Commission. The Deeds Commission was the genesis of that $31 million across a number of programs to increase funding, increase access at CSBs, provide some funding for the jail a little bit. I think I have a list of some of the items that was done. They've been following that pretty closely, and as I said, that's just a small initial amount of what really needs to be done.
Jeff, you mentioned the general fund conversions to transportation. Insurance premiums is about 150, sales tax about 100, expenses to $250 million. Do you know what the recordation piece of that is?
About 40.
About 40.
Yeah. So I think I had it in my head, it was about 200 million. Is that right? Maybe a little.
Close to 300.
300 million, you're right, 300 million. So if you added the 0.7 sales tax to the statewide, that would be about 400 million. So to actually cover that, plus you get a little more if you use it for transportation and revert it back as revenues. Now there's problems, technical problems, because that insurance premium money has been dedicated, it's a dedicated source to pay for bonding, the $2 billion bonds that were issued for both VDOT and public transit, and it's just about ended. It has ended for VDOT, but it's going to run through a little bit through 2020 for transit. But they've already been used, and so you have to figure out how to get the monies to match up.
I'm curious. Formula the policies to spend on property the same as buildings that were before or
No, I don't.
a different policy
I know Forrest was real interested in that. I'm going to have to dig into that deeper. Sure, okay.
Appreciate it.
Okay, well, yes, sir.
Just a quick question. Is that on slide 18 of the Virginia Board of Education recommendations for changes to SOQ funding, is that available currently on the State Department website? Or?
Yeah, you go to the State Department of Education, and then they have a place you can click on the Board of Education, and it'll be in there. One of the meetings, when they're on the fall meetings, they'll have all the detail you want about this. Yep. And if you need help, I'm sure Mary Jo or Katie Boyle, VACo would help with you.
Yes, Jim. I was concerned about Airbnb. Will they be taxed? I did some research and they're going to become full service. And I think Virginia Beach lost last year about $52.6 million in taxes. And I checked my area. They're at the city of Franklin. Very, very city.
How much did Virginia Beach estimate their loss from their company?
I think it was 52 million, something like that.
That sounds high, but it sounds real high. Yeah.
Maybe all.
Yeah, I think I did an analysis of the TOT tax that's lost because of the use of wholesale prices when you use like a speedy online versus the retail, which you have to pay and go right into the hotel. And that loss is more like 10 to 15 million for that. So getting to 50 for one locality would be very good. Neil, do you have any comments on Airbnb?
It's not that the Airbnb is paying taxes, the ultimate tax liability rests with the person who's engaged in that short-term rental. So they own the tax, whether they use Airbnb, Craigslist, or the community bulletin board. The question is how can you economically and efficiently collect that local transaction? And that's part of the ongoing discussions with the Airbnb representatives to make sure that all that is collected and all that is submitted back to the town.
Okay, this does work. Neil, didn't one of the key things there that Airbnb reports on 1099K with a $10,000 or higher limit, so that if they would have to report what they paid for received on a